August 8th, 1963, 3 a.m. A lonely stretch of track at Bridego Bridge, Buckinghamshire. The night is thick with fog, but for the driver of the Glasgow to London mail train, everything looks normal until he sees it. A red signal, a command to stop. He didn't know that the signal was a lie. He didn't know that 15 men were crouching in the tall grass, hearts hammering against their ribs. And he certainly didn't know that inside those train cars sat over 2.6 million pounds, the equivalent of $60 million today, just waiting to be taken. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a masterpiece of criminal engineering. It was a heist that would humiliate the British Empire and turn a gang of South London crooks into global icons. Welcome to Lou's True Crime. I'm Lou. Tonight, we're boarding the most infamous ride in criminal history. We're breaking down the planning, the execution, and the brutal aftermath of the Great Train Robbery. If you love deep dives into the world's most audacious heists, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with a fellow crime buff, and subscribe so you never miss a case. Now, let's get to work. Part 1. The blueprint of a masterpiece. Every great crime starts with a dreamer. In the early 60s, that dreamer was Bruce Reynolds. He wasn't your typical thug. He was an antique dealer by day and a mastermind by night. He loved the finer things, fast cars, jazz, and the thrill of the big score. But Reynolds was bored with small-time burglaries. He wanted something that would echo through history. He wanted a job so big that no one would ever have to work again. You can't rob a train if you don't know what's on it. The secret weapon of this heist was a man known only as the Ulsterman. To this day, his identity is a subject of debate. He was an insider, someone deep within the Postal Service who knew exactly which trains carried the high-value packages. He told Reynolds about the HVP coach, a carriage that moved millions of pounds in old banknotes from Scotland to London to be destroyed. It was untraceable, unrecorded, and ripe for the taking. Reynolds knew his own crew, the Southwest Gang, wasn't enough. He needed specialists. He reached out to a rival crew led by Gordon Goody and Buster Edwards. This wasn't a friendship, it was a merger. They brought in Charlie Wilson, the silent man, and a racing driver named Roy James. They even recruited a retired train driver because, ironically, none of the professional criminals actually knew how to move a locomotive. 15 men in total. A criminal all-star team. For months, they met in secret. This wasn't a smash and grab. Reynolds insisted on military precision. They studied the train schedules. They timed the security guards. They realized the biggest obstacle wasn't the guards, it was the signal system. If they could control the lights, they could control the train. They devised a way to use a simple 6-volt battery and a leather glove to cover the green light and force a red one. Simple, elegant, deadly. Planning at this level isn't cheap. The gang had to invest thousands of pounds up front. They bought a fleet of ex-military Land Rovers and a large truck, all painted the same olive green to look like a military convoy. They rented a hideout, Leatherslade Farm, located exactly 27 miles from the robbery site. This was their fortress. They stocked it with food, sleeping bags, and enough booze to celebrate a victory. As August approached, the tension was unbearable. They practiced the signal hack dozens of times. They practiced the human chain to move mailbags. Reynolds told them, no guns, no violence unless necessary. He wanted a clean heist. He wanted the public to respect the craft. But in the underworld, plans are just dreams until the first drop of blood or sweat hits the floor. On the night of August 7th, the atmosphere at Leatherslade Farm was electric. They ate a final meal. They checked their gloves. They checked their masks. Most of them couldn't sleep. They were about to step into the mouth of the lion. They were about to rob the most protected train in the country. Reynolds stood up and looked at his men. Tomorrow, he said, we change our lives. At midnight, the convoy left the farm. They drove in total silence. By 2 a.m., they were in position at Sears Crossing. The tracks were cold and slick with dew. In the distance, a single yellow headlight appeared on the horizon. The Glasgow to London mail train was on time. The trap was set. The red light was ready. The Great Train Robbery was about to begin. Part 2. The 30-minute war. 3 a.m. The Glasgow mail train, a roaring beast of steel and steam, was screaming down the line at 70 miles per hour. Driver Jack Mills saw the signal ahead shift from green to red. He didn't hesitate. He slammed on the brakes. Sparks flew from the wheels. bright orange streaks slashing across the dark night, as the massive locomotive screeched to a halt in the middle of nowhere. The trap had worked perfectly. The silence that followed was heavier than the train itself. Reynolds' rule of no violence lasted exactly 30 seconds. The fireman, David Whitby, climbed down to check the signal. He was immediately grabbed from the darkness. Back in the cab, driver Jack Mills tried to defend his train. He was a tough old bird, but he was outnumbered. One of the gang hit Mills over the head with an iron bar. It wasn't a lethal blow, but it was brutal. The gentlemen thieves had drawn first blood. Now came the part they had rehearsed, and the part that almost ruined everything. They needed to move the train half a mile down the track to Bridego Bridge, where the trucks were waiting. But the career criminal they assigned to drive the train froze. The massive steam engine was too complicated. He couldn't get it to budge. Panic began to set in. Millions of pounds were sitting inches away, and they were stuck. Desperate, they dragged the bleeding Jack Mills back to the controls. With iron bars held behind his head, they forced the concussed driver to move his own train to the robbery point. It was a grim procession. The train limped forward, a yellow beacon cutting through the dense, blue-black fog, carrying both victims and villains toward destiny. They reached the bridge. The rest of the gang swarmed out of the Land Rovers below like an army of ants. They had 30 minutes before the train would be missed at the next station. 30 minutes to move unimaginable wealth. They attacked the high-value package coach. The guards inside had locked the doors, but they weren't prepared for crowbars and brute force. The doors gave way with a groan of tortured metal. This is the moment that legends are made of. They stepped inside the carriage and saw them, 120 mailbags. They weren't filled with letters to Grandma. They were packed tight with used £1 and £5 notes. The sheer volume was intoxicating. They formed a human chain, sweating and grunting as they hurled sacks of cash down the embankment. It was manual labor, fueled by pure adrenaline and greed. 120 bags, 2.5 tons of cash. They loaded it all in under 25 minutes. They left the train crew handcuffed inside the carriage, told them not to move for half an hour, and vanished into the night. As the convoy sped back toward their hideout, the gravity of what they had just done hit them. There were no police sirens, no alarms, just the sound of their own engines and the rustle of £2.6 million stealing away into the darkness. They had pulled it off. Every man in that truck was now a multi-millionaire in today's value. But as the sun began to peek over the horizon, the reality of their situation began to dawn. They weren't just thieves anymore. They were the subjects of the largest manhunt in British history. They had the money, but the world was about to get very, very small. Part 3. The Fortress of Greed. 4:30 a.m. While the rest of England slept, the gang arrived at their sanctuary, Leatherslade Farm. They were exhausted, filthy, and wired on pure adrenaline. They pulled the vehicles deep into the barn, killing the engines. For a moment, there was total silence. Then, the cheering started. They hadn't just robbed a train. They had humiliated the authorities. They were safe, or so they thought. They began to dump the bags. It wasn't just a pile of money. It was a wall of it. 2.5 tons of cash. In today's money, we're talking over $60 million. Most of these men had never seen £1,000 at once, and now they were standing knee-deep in a fortune. They didn't count it, they weighed it. The sheer scale of the win was staggering. But with that much money comes a very specific kind of weight, the weight of the target now painted on their backs. In one of the most surreal moments in criminal history, the gang decided to kill time by playing Monopoly. But they didn't use the paper money that came with the box. They used the real thing. They were throwing hundreds of thousands of pounds around the table like it was pocket change. It was the ultimate gangster flex. But in their arrogance, they were leaving behind something deadlier than a trail of breadcrumbs: their fingerprints. By sunrise, the Big Six at Scotland Yard were scrambling. The news had broken, and the public was in a frenzy. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a slap in the face to the British establishment. Jack Slipper, the legendary investigator, was put in charge of the flying squad. He was a dog with a bone, and he knew something the gang didn't. A heist this big requires a hideout nearby. He ordered his men to search every farm and outbuilding within a 30-mile radius of the tracks. The mood at the farm soured quickly. Every news bulletin increased the bounty. Every broadcast emphasized the brutal attack on the driver, Jack Mills. The gang realized they weren't being viewed as clever thieves. They were the most wanted men in the British Empire. Paranoia began to seep into the floorboards. Was that a plane overhead? Was that a car on the distant road? The fortress was starting to feel like a cage. Reynolds had ordered a total cleanup. Everything was supposed to be wiped down or burned. But these were high-stakes criminals, not professional cleaners. They left behind a monopoly board handled by everyone. They left behind a saucer of milk for a cat. They left behind a bottle of ketchup with a clear, perfect thumbprint. They thought they had time. They thought the police were days away. They were wrong. Originally, they planned to stay at the farm for weeks until the heat died down. But the radio reports were too close for comfort. The decision was made: split the money, burn the farm, and vanish. They divvied up the loot, roughly £150,000 per person. In 1963, that was enough to buy a street of houses. They scrambled into different cars, heading in different directions, leaving one man behind to torch the farm and erase the evidence. This was the fatal mistake. The man hired to burn the farm took the money and ran without finishing the job. He left the fortress standing. Within 48 hours, a local herdsman would notice something strange about the quiet farm down the road. He would call the police. And when Jack Slipper walked through those doors, he wouldn't find a burned-out shell. He would find a treasure map of fingerprints. The hunt was on. Part 4. The Global Shadow. When the police arrived at Leatherslade Farm, they didn't find a crime scene. They found a gift shop. Because the fire never started, the gang had essentially left their signatures on everything. The Monopoly board, the ketchup bottles, the half-eaten food. It was a forensic gold mine. Scotland Yard didn't have to guess who did it. The fingerprints told the whole story. Within days, the most wanted posters were plastered across every pub in London. Jack Slipper, or Slipper of the Yard, was now the face of the law. He wasn't interested in the romance of the heist. To him, these men were just thugs who had hurt a train driver. He unleashed a dragnet that paralyzed the London underworld. Informants started whispering. The pressure was so intense that some members of the gang couldn't handle the heat. The first few arrests were made in record time. Roger Corddry and William Bowell were caught with thousands of pounds stuffed into suitcases. In 1964, the hammer came down. The British establishment wanted to send a message: you don't touch the Queen's mail. The sentences were staggering. Most of the gang received 30 years. It was more than some murderers got at the time. The public was shocked, and the gang was devastated. But while half the crew was heading to high-security cells, the big fish, Bruce Reynolds, Buster Edwards, and Charlie Wilson, had already vanished. Bruce Reynolds knew he couldn't hide forever with his own face. He fled to southeast England, then to France, where he underwent plastic surgery to change his appearance. He wasn't a South London crook anymore. He was a gentleman of means. He bought a new nose, a new chin, and a new identity. He was living a cinematic life, but every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a ghost. While the police were kicking down doors in London, Buster Edwards and Bruce Reynolds were living the high life in Mexico. They had millions to spend, and for a while, it felt like they had won. They lived in luxury villas, drove fast cars, and blended into the expatriate scene. But the problem with dirty money is that it runs out faster than you think, and you can't exactly call the bank for a loan when you're a fugitive. And then there was Ronnie Biggs. He hadn't escaped to Mexico yet. He was in Wandsworth Prison serving his 30-year sentence. But Ronnie wasn't a man meant for a cell. In 1965, he pulled off a daring escape, scaling a 30-foot wall with a rope ladder and disappearing into a waiting furniture van. He fled to Paris for his own plastic surgery and then vanished toward Australia and eventually Brazil. He was becoming a folk hero, the one who got away. By the late 60s, the money was drying up. Reynolds had moved his family to Canada and then back to France, but the firm was broken. The camaraderie of the heist was gone, replaced by the crushing loneliness of a man who can never go home. The Great Train Robbers were no longer a gang. They were isolated islands, waiting for the tide of justice to come back in. In 1968, 5 years after the heist, Bruce Reynolds did the unthinkable. He went back to England. He was tired of running, tired of the fake names, and almost entirely out of cash. He moved into a quiet house in Torquay, trying to live as a normal man. But Slipper of the Yard was still dreaming of him. The hunt hadn't ended. It had just gone quiet, and the silence was about to be broken. Part 5. The Final Stop. November 1968. Torquay. Mastermind Bruce Reynolds was living as Mr. Thompson, He thought he had successfully blended into the wallpaper of suburban England. But Jack Slipper never stopped looking. When Slipper walked into that kitchen, he didn't see a gentleman of means. He saw the man who cost the British government millions. Slipper's first words were legendary. "Hello, Bruce. It's been a long time." Reynolds didn't fight. He just finished his tea. The brain of the operation was finally in handcuffs. Buster Edwards had returned to England years earlier. He had run out of money in Mexico and realized that a life on the run wasn't worth the cost of being away from his family. He surrendered, served 9 years, and ended up selling flowers outside Waterloo Station. People would walk by the Great Train Robber every day, buying roses for their wives, never knowing they were talking to a man who once held the world by the throat. It was a humble end for a man who had lived like a king. But then there was Ronnie Biggs. Ronnie became the ultimate one who got away. Living in Brazil, where he couldn't be extradited, he turned his criminal past into a brand. He recorded songs with the Sex Pistols, hosted tours for fans, and became a global celebrity. He was the thumb in the eye of the British establishment. While his partners were rotting in cells or selling flowers, Biggs was sunbathing on Copacabana. He was the ghost that Scotland Yard could see, but never touch. We often call this a gentleman's heist, but for one man, it was a death sentence. Jack Mills, the driver who was struck with the iron bar, never truly recovered. He suffered from constant headaches and trauma for the rest of his life. He died in 1970, just 7 years after the heist. When we talk about the millions stolen and the glamorous escapes, we have to remember Jack. The no violence rule was a lie the gang told themselves to sleep at night. So, where did the money go? Out of the £2.6 million, less than $400,000 was ever recovered. Most of it vanished into the underworld. It went to crooked lawyers, expensive hideouts, and taxes paid to other gangsters to keep their mouths shut. The Great Train Robbers didn't end up as billionaires. Most ended up broke. Their fortunes bled dry by the cost of staying invisible. The heist didn't make them rich, it just made them famous. In 2001, the King of Rio finally came home. Ronnie Biggs, crippled by strokes and unable to speak, surrendered to the British authorities. He said he wanted one last pint of bitter in an English pub. He was immediately sent to prison to finish his sentence. The legend of the Great Train Robbery ended not with a shootout, but with an old man in a wheelchair seeking a home that had long ago forgotten him. Today, Bridego Bridge is just another quiet spot in the English countryside. The steam trains are gone, replaced by high-speed electric rails. But the shadow of 1963 still hangs over the tracks. The Great Train Robbery remains the benchmark for every heist that followed. It was the moment the working-class underworld took on the empire, and for 30 minutes, they won. 15 men, 1 train, and a mountain of cash that changed the world. The Great Train Robbery wasn't just a crime. It was a cultural explosion that we're still talking about 60 years later. What do you think? Were they folk heroes or just common thugs? And do you think the Ulsterman, the insider who gave them the tip, is still out there somewhere with his share of the millions? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this 5-part deep dive, hit that like button and share this with your friends. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Lou's True Crime. We've got more heists, more mob bosses, and more mysteries coming your way. I'm Lou, thanks for